In 1303 BCE, in the blazing heart of ancient Egypt, a child cried into the desert night, unaware that he would one day be called the Great and remembered for millennia. This was Ramses II, born into a world of gods, kings, and unending ambition. But unlike ordinary children, his life was already scripted before his first breath. Every moment, every choice, every triumph or failure would be measured not by personal happiness, but by destiny. From the very beginning, Ramses' world was one of extremes. The Nile flowed like liquid gold, nourishing fields, people, and dreams, but it was also a highway for invaders, a path for rebellion, a reminder that Egypt's greatness was fragile. Pharaohs before him had come and gone, their names fading into dust, their legacies broken by poor battles, political mistakes, or the sheer cruelty of fate. And yet, from the first moments of Ramses' life, the gods themselves seemed to whisper that this child would not fade. He would endure, he would conquer, he would shape history. Ramses was not born in isolation. He was born into a family of ambition. His father, Seti I, was a stern, calculating ruler, a king who believed that Egypt could only survive if it was stronger than any threat, whether from across the desert sands or within its own cities. Seti's vision was simple. Egypt needed a ruler who would not just defend it, but expand it. And from the start, Ramses was being molded to fill that role. Imagine being a child, yet every smile, every step, every word you utter is being measured against the weight of an empire. This was Ramses' reality. Play was not just play, it was preparation. Education was not just knowledge, it was strategy. Even affection came with expectations. Your loyalty was to Egypt first, your desires second, and while other children might learn to sing, paint, or dream, Ramses learned the secrets of war, the language of loyalty, and the ruthlessness required to command men. By the time he could walk, Ramses was already practicing the gestures of leadership. In the courts of Thebes, he observed generals argue, priests chant, and advisors plot. He learned how to read faces for fear or deceit. He learned that every smile could hide betrayal, every promise could mask ambition. And slowly, deliberately, the boy grew into a mind capable of both brilliance and cruelty, the perfect combination for a pharaoh who would be remembered for thousands of years. Yet even in this carefully structured upbringing, there were moments of danger, moments that reminded Ramses and all of Egypt just how fragile life could be. Rival factions, ambitious nobles, and foreign invaders circled like vultures. Egypt was a prize, not just a home. One wrong decision, one misstep, and the empire could crumble. Ramses' childhood was not a bubble of safety. It was a battlefield in miniature. Every lesson, every challenge, every lesson in obedience prepared him for that ultimate stage, the throne. And here's what history rarely tells you: being born destined for greatness was as much a curse as a blessing. The child could not cry freely, could not stumble without consequence, could not dream without expectation. Even as a boy, Ramses felt the pressure of eyes that would never forgive weakness. He was surrounded by teachers, warriors, and advisors, yet no one could teach him the one thing he truly needed: how to survive the weight of destiny itself. By the time Ramses reached his teens, he was no longer just a boy, he was a symbol. Every gesture, every word, every glance mattered. Egypt watched, the gods watched, and his enemies waited. He was being forged into a leader who would not only carry a crown but bear the very soul of a civilization on his shoulders. And make no mistake, this was no ordinary crown. It was a crown heavy with responsibility, danger, and the knowledge that history would judge him mercilessly. And so Ramses' story begins, not with a battlefield, not with a victory, but with a cry, a child's cry echoing through the golden Nile Valley, a prophecy in the wind that Egypt would rise, that its enemies would tremble, and that one man would shape the world with ambition, cunning, and sheer unyielding will. Because from the moment he was born, Ramses was already at war with the world, with men, and with destiny itself. And the story of how he became Egypt's greatest pharaoh, the architect of empires, and a living legend begins here, with a boy who had no choice but to rise. Ramses II did not become a legend by accident. Every skill, every tactic, every calculated decision was forged long before he ever touched a battlefield. To understand the rise of Egypt's greatest pharaoh, we must first step into the shadowed halls of the royal palace, where childhood was not measured in games or laughter, but in strategy, discipline, and relentless preparation. From a young age, Ramses was trained to think like a king and fight like a god. The walls of the palace echoed with the commands of his tutors, who were more than teachers. They were generals, priests, and spies, all ensuring that the boy would grow into the perfect ruler. Reading, writing, and mathematics were tools for governance. History and law were weapons to manipulate allies and intimidate rivals, and lessons in warfare, strategy, siege tactics, archery, and chariot maneuvering were drilled daily until the boy's muscles and mind became a single disciplined instrument. Every day was a test. Every mistake was a lesson in survival. If Ramses faltered in his memorization of military formations, he was corrected with severity. If he struggled to remember the names of generals and governors, he was reminded that forgetting could cost lives, the lives of soldiers who would one day follow him into war. Imagine being a child under that pressure, expected to internalize not only knowledge but instinct, a lifetime's worth of lessons compressed into mere years. But education alone could not shape Ramses into a warrior. Physical training was just as important, if not more so. From sunrise to sunset, the prince ran, wrestled, and sparred. Chariots rattled across the palace courtyards as young Ramses learned to maneuver them at full speed. Archery targets were placed in every corner of the training grounds, and he was forced to strike with unerring precision. Missing even once could bring shame. His body was honed for endurance, agility, and strength, but it was also molded to endure pain and fatigue, to carry the burdens of war as easily as his own armor. Yet there was another, subtler form of training that was even more demanding: observation. Ramses was taught to read people before he could read words. Advisors whispered, generals schemed, and foreign envoys masked their intentions behind courteous bows. The young prince had to see through deception, sense danger before it arrived, and learn that the most powerful weapon was not a sword or chariot, but a sharp mind paired with relentless will. By the age of 12, Ramses could anticipate a general's tactic, recognize a spy, and understand the delicate balance between fear and respect in leadership. But let's not romanticize this childhood. There was no room for innocence. Friends were rare, play was measured, and laughter often came with consequences. If Ramses showed weakness, if he faltered in courage, it was noted not just by his teachers, but by his father, Pharaoh Seti I, whose gaze alone could ignite fear. Seti's lessons were not delivered gently. They were precise, deliberate, and sometimes cruel. The boy had to understand early that power was born from sacrifice, and that ruling was a burden heavier than any crown. And the pressure was not just internal. Egypt itself was a kingdom under constant threat. To the north, the Hittites loomed like storm clouds over the borderlands. Their armies were disciplined, their leaders cunning, and their ambitions relentless. To the south, Nubian forces tested Egypt's defenses along the Nile. And within the heart of the kingdom, noble families jostled for influence, each willing to betray or manipulate to gain favor. Ramses' childhood, therefore, was not a protected bubble of privilege. It was a microcosm of the battlefield he would one day inherit. Every lesson, every punishment, every test prepared him for the reality that power could be taken away in an instant, and only the strong, the clever, and the ruthless survived. At the same time, Ramses was introduced to the concept of divinity early. Pharaohs were considered living gods, intermediaries between mortals and the eternal deities. For Ramses, this was not abstract theology. It was a daily reminder of responsibility and expectation. Every gesture, every word, every decision would be judged not only by humans but by the gods themselves. To fail was not merely shameful, it was sacrilegious. And so the boy learned to carry himself with the poise of a king, the confidence of a god, and the unflinching gaze of a ruler who could not and would not falter. By the age of 16, Ramses was already assuming responsibilities far beyond his years. He accompanied his father on inspections of the borderlands, observing troops, negotiating with local governors, and sometimes even leading minor skirmishes. These experiences were invaluable. He saw firsthand the chaos of battle, the fragility of alliances, and the necessity of swift, decisive action. And with each test, each mission, each moment of danger, Ramses internalized a crucial lesson that leadership was measured not by titles or ceremonies, but by action, courage, and the ability to inspire loyalty or fear in those around him. Even the royal household was part of this rigorous education. Ramses was constantly surrounded by advisors who challenged him, questioned him, and tested his judgment. Every conversation was a battle of wits. Every lesson in etiquette, diplomacy, or ceremony was a lesson in power. By the time he reached adulthood, Ramses would know that subtlety could be more lethal than a sword, and patience could achieve what brute force could not. But perhaps the most important aspect of Ramses' training was psychological. From a young age, he was taught to embrace ambition, to crave glory, and to envision himself as the man who would leave a permanent mark on history. He was shown the tombs of his ancestors, the monuments of the past, and reminded that immortality was earned through victories, through courage, and through the ability to command men and shape the world. He was told repeatedly that greatness demanded sacrifice, that fear was a tool, that enemies could be manipulated as easily as soldiers could be led. That destiny was not given, it was seized. And yet in these formative years, there were moments of humanity that remind us Ramses was still a boy. Moments when he laughed quietly with a servant, when he paused to watch the river flow, or when he asked questions about the lives of ordinary Egyptians. But these moments were fleeting. For the prince, even joy came with caution, because everything he experienced was shaping him into the pharaoh who would one day carry Egypt on his shoulders. By the time Ramses reached 20, he was no longer a boy. He was a warrior, a strategist, a leader, a living embodiment of Egypt's strength. His mind had been sharpened like the edge of a sword. His body had been conditioned to endure extremes. His heart had been trained to suppress fear and hesitation, and his spirit had been molded to embrace destiny, no matter the cost. This was not merely preparation for battle, this was preparation for legend. The making of a warrior prince was about more than military skill. It was about shaping a man who could command loyalty, inspire fear, and bend both allies and enemies to his will. Ramses' childhood, though harsh, was a crucible. And like all crucibles, it was designed to produce something extraordinary, a ruler who would be remembered not for the years he lived, but for the empire he shaped, the battles he fought, and the name he carved into eternity. By the end of his training, Ramses was no longer just a boy, or even a prince. He was a living promise of Egypt's future. Every soldier who would one day march behind him, every enemy who would face him on the battlefield, every monument that would bear his name, all were echoes of this period, the years when the seeds of greatness were planted, watered with discipline, and forged in fire. And yet, even with all this preparation, nothing could have truly readied Ramses for what awaited him. The challenges, the betrayals, the wars, and the decisions that would define his reign were beyond even the most exhaustive training. Destiny was not a teacher, it was a battlefield. And Ramses, the warrior prince, would soon learn that to lead Egypt was to face not just enemies across the desert, but the weight of history itself. Because the making of a warrior prince was only the beginning, and the lessons he learned in those formative years would echo across centuries, shaping the man who would become Ramses the Great, the pharaoh who would outlast time itself. By the time Ramses II was stepping into adulthood, Egypt's grandeur was undeniable, but so too was its vulnerability. The Nile Valley shimmered under the sun, its fertile fields feeding millions, its cities alive with trade and culture. Temples rose like stairways to the gods, their walls painted with stories of divine kings and victorious campaigns. Yet beyond the borders danger brewed, and the very survival of the empire hung by a thread. To the north, the Hittites loomed, a kingdom of disciplined warriors and ambitious kings. Their lands stretched across what we now call Turkey and Syria, and their armies were feared for their iron weapons, powerful chariots, and unyielding strategies. For decades, they had challenged Egypt's influence in the Levant, demanding tribute, testing defenses, and sending raiding parties that threatened cities along the border. Every Egyptian soldier stationed in the north knew the stakes. A single mistake could mean defeat, loss of territory, or worse, invasion into the heart of the empire itself. South of the Nile, the Nubians presented a different kind of threat. Unlike the Hittites, they did not always attack in full armies, but their raids along Egypt's southern border were persistent. They tested the patience of governors, disrupted trade along the Nile, and reminded the Egyptians that the river, which fed them, could also be a highway for rebellion and invasion. Ramses would soon understand that a ruler could not simply rely on walls, troops, or monuments. A king needed intelligence, foresight, and the ability to act decisively before threats even reached the gates. And yet, the greatest danger sometimes came not from outsiders, but from within. Egypt's own nobility, while sworn to the crown, carried ambitions of their own. Governors in distant provinces occasionally conspired to increase their power, and influential families plotted alliances that could challenge the pharaoh's authority. Ramses learned early that a ruler's eye must see everywhere at once, that loyalty was fragile and could vanish in a heartbeat. The palace, while magnificent, was also a stage for political intrigue, where whispers of betrayal carried as much danger as an invading army. Imagine the pressure on a young prince in this environment. Ramses could not simply enjoy the privileges of his royal birth. Every lesson, every patrol, every inspection was a reminder. Egypt's survival depended on him. One wrong decision could cost lives, spark rebellion, or invite foreign conquest. His training as a warrior prince was not just for honor, it was a matter of life and death. At the border forts along the north, Ramses witnessed firsthand the tension that simmered between kingdoms. Egyptian soldiers, clad in bronze armor and gripping spears, patrolled desolate outposts, knowing full well that any Hittite patrol could appear at dawn ready to strike. He saw governors scrambling to gather reinforcements, supply lines stretched thin, and the fear in men's eyes when a skirmish erupted. These moments left an impression that would never fade, the understanding that war was not abstract, it was immediate, brutal, and personal. Even diplomacy was a battlefield. Egyptian envoys met with Hittite kings and princes in grand halls filled with incense and opulent furniture, discussing borders, trade, and tribute. But every word was measured. Every smile could mask hostility. Every handshake could conceal treachery. Ramses learned to read the subtleties of power, that treaties could be weapons, negotiations a test of strength, and patience a form of aggression. One misread gesture could trigger war, one hesitation could cost an entire province. Ramses' father, Seti I, was relentless in ensuring the prince understood these lessons. There were nights when Ramses could not sleep, pacing the corridors of the palace, memorizing maps of the north and south, plotting strategies, and imagining battles that had not yet occurred. Seti would challenge him relentlessly, asking the prince what he would do if a city rebelled, if a Hittite army crossed the border, or if a governor betrayed him. Each question carried weight, and each answer was scrutinized. Failure was not an option. And then there was the human cost of war, something Ramses witnessed early. Refugees fleeing skirmishes, villages burned, families torn apart. These were not distant stories, but realities that shaped his understanding of leadership. A king did not simply command armies, he carried the weight of every life in his kingdom. Ramses learned that victories would be celebrated, but failures would be remembered in silence, in grief, in the eyes of mothers who lost sons and children who lost fathers. By the time Ramses reached adulthood, the threats had grown more immediate. Hittite generals conducted raids that tested Egyptian fortifications. Nubian chieftains challenged southern garrisons, and whispers of internal rebellion grew louder. The young prince, now trained in warfare, diplomacy, and strategy, began to take on real responsibilities. He was sent to inspect forts, lead troops on minor campaigns, and negotiate with neighboring tribes. Every decision, every action, every glance in these moments contributed to the building of his reputation. It was during these years that Ramses learned perhaps the most important lesson of all. Fear can be as powerful as swords, and loyalty as potent as armies. A ruler must inspire both. He had to be a presence that commanded attention, respect, and even awe. Soldiers needed to trust that their leader could guide them through chaos. Governors needed to know that betrayal would carry consequences far greater than imagination. And enemies, near and far, had to understand that Ramses II was a force capable of shaping destiny itself. Egypt's enemies were not just external. The Hittites, with their iron chariots and relentless ambition, represented a constant looming threat. The Nubians, while smaller in number, were fierce and unpredictable. Internal unrest simmered like a hidden fire, ready to erupt at any sign of weakness. And yet, all of these challenges were necessary for Ramses' transformation. He could not learn strategy in peace. He could not understand the value of loyalty without witnessing treachery. He could not become a king capable of commanding an empire without experiencing the pressures of threats from all sides. The world around him was dangerous, relentless, and unforgiving, and the boy who once played among the palace gardens now walked with the weight of an empire on his shoulders. Every action mattered, every lesson was permanent, and every choice could tip the balance between survival and destruction. Ramses had been molded by fire, sharpened by pressure, and tempered by the reality that Egypt's greatness could never be taken for granted. By the end of this period, Ramses had become more than a prince. He was a symbol of hope and strength, a living promise that Egypt could endure, expand, and dominate. He understood that a ruler's task was not merely to govern, but to anticipate threats before they arrived, to inspire devotion as easily as fear, and to wield power with precision, intelligence, and unflinching resolve. And so, as Egypt's enemies closed in on every frontier, north, south, and within, Ramses was ready. Not just as a warrior, not just as a prince, but as the future pharaoh who would face the Hittites, confront rebellion, and etch his name into the annals of history. Every invasion, every threat, every whispered plot was a lesson in preparation. Every danger that crept along the borders would one day test him in ways that even the most rigorous training could not fully predict. Because being a pharaoh was not about crowns, monuments, or glory. It was about survival, strategy, and the relentless will to endure when everything, armies, allies, and enemies alike, was against you. Ramses II had been shaped for this moment, and the world was about to discover that Egypt's greatest pharaoh was ready to meet destiny head-on, no matter the cost. In 1279 BCE, at the age of 25, Ramses II ascended the throne of Egypt. The palace was alive with ceremonies, incense thick in the air, golden banners reflecting the sunlight, priests chanting the names of gods and kings long past. Yet behind the grandeur, behind the pomp and the crowd, a storm of responsibility pressed down on him. Ramses was no longer a prince under his father's shadow. He was the pharaoh, the ultimate authority, and for the first time, every decision, every glance, every word he spoke carried weight, not just for him, but for all of Egypt. At this moment, Egypt was both a jewel and a battlefield. The borders he had observed and trained to defend were fragile. The Hittites had not forgotten the raids of previous years. Nubian forces remained restless in the south, and within the kingdom, ambitious governors and officials watched him closely, ready to exploit any misstep. Ramses understood instantly that being pharaoh was not a reward. It was a trap, a crucible, and it demanded more than skill or courage. It demanded perfection. Imagine being handed absolute power at 25. The crown is heavy, yes, but heavier still is the knowledge that one wrong decision could destroy an empire. How does a young man carry that weight and still command loyalty? Ramses was about to show the world. From the first day of his reign, Ramses knew he had to make a statement. Egypt could not survive if its enemies doubted its strength, and the people could not prosper if they doubted their leader. He began by reviewing the military, inspecting every garrison along the Nile. He rode from fortress to fortress, testing not just soldiers but commanders. Would they obey without hesitation? Could they withstand pressure, fear, and chaos? These early days were not ceremonial, they were trials by fire, and Ramses passed them with the precision of a man who had been trained all his life for this moment. Every action sent a message. Ramses was not a boy, he was Pharaoh. His advisors whispered about his audacity, soldiers marveled at his poise, and even the nobility, watching him closely, began to sense a ruler who would not tolerate weakness. But with power came fear, both instilling it in others and guarding against it himself. Ramses knew that being a great king required balancing authority with inspiration, punishment with reward, awe with approachability. Misjudge this balance, and even a single whisper could lead to rebellion. Here's the shocking truth. Even the most celebrated pharaohs were only as secure as the loyalty of those around them. In the shadows of the palace, betrayal was always possible. Ramses would soon face tests that would push him to the edge, not just as a leader, but as a man. To consolidate his power, Ramses also understood the importance of visibility. Monument building was not vanity, it was strategy. Statues, temples, and inscriptions proclaimed his victories before they even occurred. He transformed the landscape of Egypt into a map of influence. Every stone told a story: obedience, fear, loyalty, and the promise of retribution against those who dared oppose him. Egyptians saw not just a king, they saw a god walking among them, omnipresent and unyielding. And yet, the real challenge was far more personal. Ramses had to earn the loyalty of his people, not through fear alone, but through acts that commanded respect. He hosted festivals, honored the gods, and personally oversaw justice in the cities. But every display of benevolence was a calculated act. Mercy without strategy could be interpreted as weakness. Generosity without precision could invite chaos. Ramses's every action was a performance designed to reinforce the idea he was absolute and Egypt would survive only under his guidance. You might think power at this age comes easily, but the truth is darker. Every day, Ramses faced decisions where there was no right answer. One misstep could cost thousands of lives. What he did next would define his reign for decades and shock his enemies. Military campaigns were central to his rule from day one. Ramses did not inherit a peaceful empire. He inherited a kingdom under siege. He launched expeditions to secure Egypt's borders, personally commanding troops and strategizing every maneuver. His skill in diplomacy matched his prowess on the battlefield. He sent envoys, negotiated treaties, and used intelligence to anticipate enemy movements. By blending diplomacy and warfare, Ramses created a reputation for brilliance that made allies trust him and enemies fear him. Even more striking, Ramses understood the psychology of power. Fear could paralyze, but awe could command. When enemies saw his chariots thunder across the desert, when villagers heard the stories of his early victories, Ramses' legend began to grow faster than his actual battles. Myth and reality intertwined, making him seem almost superhuman. Yet behind the legend was a man who had spent decades preparing for this moment. Every scar, every drill, every lesson culminating in the ability to make impossible decisions under pressure. Internal threats were as significant as external ones. Governors tested his patience, officials sought to manipulate him, and even members of his own family could have undermined him. Ramses learned quickly that absolute rule required both the carrot and the stick. Loyalty had to be cultivated, fear had to be instilled, and every public act had to reinforce the idea that the pharaoh was not merely a figurehead, he was the embodiment of Egypt itself. Here's a chilling thought. Ramses' greatest enemies weren't always foreign armies, they were the very people he ruled. And soon a test would come that would force him to balance ruthlessness with strategy in a way few rulers ever faced. Religion was another tool. Ramses didn't just honor the gods, he positioned himself as their living representative. Temples were more than worship sites, they were political instruments. By aligning himself with divine authority, he made rebellion not only dangerous politically, but sacrilegious. Opponents could not simply rise against him without risking both death and eternal damnation in the eyes of the people. He was not just Pharaoh, he was the god on earth, a living bridge between mortals and eternity. Yet absolute rule also carried isolation. Ramses could trust few. Every smile in the court was measured, every gesture observed. Advisors could betray him for power, soldiers could desert him for fear, allies could conspire against him for ambition. And in the quiet moments of the night, Ramses would have felt the weight of Egypt pressing down on his shoulders, loneliness, danger, and expectation intertwined in a constant reminder. Being Pharaoh was not about privilege, it was about survival. By the end of his first year, Ramses had transformed from a trained warrior prince into a commanding pharaoh. His early campaigns, his strategic diplomacy, and his unyielding public presence had established him as a ruler who would not be ignored, doubted, or defeated easily. But this was only the beginning. Egypt's enemies were watching, waiting for the slightest weakness, and the most famous battles of Ramses' life, the ones that would define him for all eternity, were still ahead. And here's the kicker. The moment Ramses faced the Hittites on the battlefield of Kadesh, everything he had trained for would be tested. Victory, defeat, betrayal, and legend would collide in ways even he could not have imagined. The story of Ramses II was only beginning, and the pharaoh's true power and its cost was about to be revealed to the world. The year was 1274 BCE, and Egypt was on the brink of confrontation. Ramses II, now fully crowned pharaoh, knew that securing the empire's northern border was not optional. It was a matter of survival. The Hittites, relentless and ambitious, had been expanding southward for decades, testing Egypt's defenses along the Levantine corridor. Cities sent desperate letters for help. Garrisons reported skirmishes. Merchants whispered of raids and sabotage. The stage was set for a clash that would determine the fate of two great empires. Ramses approached the campaign with the meticulousness of a chess master preparing for the game of a lifetime. Troop movements, supply lines, scouts, every detail was accounted for. He studied the terrain, analyzing river crossings, mountain passes, and desert approaches. He memorized the capabilities of every unit under his command: infantry, archers, charioteers, and cavalry. Each soldier's skill, experience, and temperament were assessed, and he assigned tasks to match strengths to strategy. Nothing was left to chance, yet preparation was more than logistics. Ramses understood the importance of morale. His soldiers would march hundreds of miles under the scorching sun, and the success of the campaign depended as much on their confidence in him as on their weapons. He rode among the troops, inspecting equipment, adjusting formations, and speaking directly to commanders and soldiers alike. In every word, he infused determination. In every glance, he communicated unyielding authority. The men began to believe that their pharaoh was more than a ruler. He was a living force capable of turning impossible odds into victory. Even with careful planning, doubt lingered. The northern frontier was treacherous, full of unfamiliar terrain and well-fortified Hittite positions. Ramses knew that a single miscalculation could spell disaster. Could his chariots cross the rivers in time? Would his archers hold their lines against Hittite infantry? Were the scouts reporting accurately, or could enemy spies be feeding him false information? The weight of these questions pressed on him constantly. A pharaoh could not afford hesitation. Every decision was a gamble, every movement a test of his skill as a commander and his ability to predict the unpredictable. Egypt itself contributed to the pressure. The economy depended on the safe passage of goods, grain, and wealth from north to south. The people looked to Ramses not only as a warrior, but as a provider, a protector, and a symbol of divine order. The stakes were staggering. Failure could weaken faith in the pharaoh, embolden enemies, and invite rebellion. Even before stepping onto the battlefield, Ramses faced the harsh reality that leadership was an endless balancing act between aggression, strategy, and the expectations of a kingdom that saw him as both man and god. Ramses' preparation also included psychological warfare. He knew that the perception of strength could be as effective as actual strength. His envoys spread rumors of massive reinforcements, of unbreakable formations, of chariots faster than the wind. The goal was simple: make the Hittites hesitate, make them doubt their own plans, and give Egypt the advantage before swords were drawn. Ramses understood that war was not only fought with weapons, it was fought in minds and hearts, and every rumor, every carefully staged movement, was part of his strategy. The march itself was grueling. Thousands of soldiers moved as one, caravans of supplies trailing behind. Chariots rattled over rough terrain, horses strained under heat and distance, and infantry marched with relentless precision. At night, camps were established with meticulous attention to defense, fires kept low to avoid detection, and sentries rotated constantly. Ramses himself moved among the ranks, sharing water, checking equipment, and quietly observing the discipline of his men. Every action reinforced a single message: failure was not an option, and the pharaoh was present, aware, and uncompromising. Along the route, Ramses faced unexpected challenges. Desert storms slowed movement, rivers swelled beyond anticipated levels, and scouts returned with conflicting reports. He had to make rapid decisions: which paths to take, which units to detach, how to conserve supplies while maintaining the confidence of thousands of soldiers. Each decision carried immediate consequences, and mistakes could quickly turn a march into a nightmare. Ramses' training as a warrior prince, as a strategist groomed under his father's watchful eye, now proved invaluable. Amid these challenges, Ramses displayed a combination of courage and adaptability that would define his reign. When one division faltered during a river crossing, he personally led reinforcements, stabilizing the line and restoring confidence. When scouts reported potential Hittite ambushes, he adjusted formations and reinforced flanks. The pharaoh's presence was more than symbolic, it was operational. Soldiers began to whisper that their king was not just a figurehead, but a force that could shape events with a single command. The psychological stakes were immense. The men knew they marched under the eyes of a god-king, and every misstep could bring not only physical danger but shame. Soldiers' morale depended on Ramses's example. If he faltered, they would falter. If he displayed hesitation, panic could spread like wildfire through the ranks. Leadership in these moments was as much about projection as execution, and Ramses understood that perception could often determine the outcome before the first arrow flew. As the army approached Kadesh, intelligence suggested that the Hittites had prepared formidable defenses, including thousands of troops hidden in strategic positions. Ramses faced a dilemma: press forward aggressively and risk walking into a trap, or proceed cautiously and lose the initiative. The pharaoh's mind raced through possibilities, weighing the enemy's strength, terrain, and his own forces' capabilities. Every moment demanded clarity, courage, and decisiveness. Hesitation could mean defeat. Rashness could mean annihilation. Even within this calculated tension, Ramses did not ignore the human element. He spoke to soldiers personally, recognized bravery, and reminded them of what they fought for: Egypt's survival, the honor of their families, and the legacy of their pharaoh. He cultivated a sense of purpose, embedding the idea that each man's actions mattered in the larger story of Egypt's destiny. Loyalty was earned not just through orders but through inspiration, a principle Ramses would use throughout his reign. As the army drew nearer to the Hittite positions, rumors of enemy spies and internal dissent reached the pharaoh. Could he trust the reports? Could he trust even his closest generals? The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily, yet Ramses remained resolute. This march, which began as preparation, had now become a test of everything he had learned: strategy, leadership, psychology, and the ability to make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information. And in this tension, a larger truth emerged: the path to legend is never straightforward. Every step of the march was a lesson in patience, foresight, and calculated risk. Ramses' preparation was not merely logistical, it was mental, emotional, and symbolic. He was molding not only the army, but also himself, preparing for the battle that would define his reign and echo through history. By the time the plains of Kadesh came into view, the pharaoh's forces were disciplined, coordinated, and tense with anticipation. The stage was set. Ramses had transformed his army into a living extension of his will, and every movement, from chariot formation to supply wagon, had been honed for the moment that could either immortalize him or destroy Egypt's northern frontier. The march north was more than a journey. It was the crucible in which Ramses's legend would begin to burn, where every choice, every command, and every challenge would be magnified by the presence of history itself. And soon on the plains of Kadesh, the true test would come, one that would challenge not only Ramses's skill but his courage, his cunning, and his ability to turn near defeat into a story that would echo through millennia. The morning sun rose over the plains of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, casting long shadows across a landscape that would soon be drenched in blood and fear. Ramses II, Pharaoh of Egypt, stood at the forefront of his army, surveying the vast expanse. Tens of thousands of soldiers stretched as far as the eye could see, infantry, chariots, and archers, all prepared for the battle that could determine the fate of Egypt's northern frontier. But despite careful planning and preparation, the tension in the air was palpable. Something told Ramses that this war would not follow the script he had written in maps and plans. The Hittites were cunning. Intelligence had reported a large enemy force hiding behind the hills, ready to ambush the Egyptians, and indeed scouts soon confirmed it. The Hittite army, far larger than anticipated, waited with thousands of chariots and disciplined infantry, positioned to strike with devastating force. Ramses' heart must have raced. Every strategist knows that surprise is one of the deadliest weapons, and the pharaoh now faced it firsthand. His army was strong, yes, but the Hittite force was immense. Would his soldiers hold? Could he turn the tide if disaster struck? Ramses charged forward, leading the first wave of chariots into the open plains. The thunder of horses echoed like rolling storms. Soldiers raised their shields, arrows flew, and the clash of metal began. At first, the Egyptians gained ground, their discipline and coordination allowing them to push back portions of the enemy lines. But then, the Hittites revealed their trap. Hidden divisions struck from unexpected directions, enveloping sections of Ramses' forces. The pharaoh's chariot became a beacon in the chaos, and every eye turned toward him for guidance. In the heat of battle, the stakes were clear. Failure was unthinkable. If the pharaoh fell, Egypt could collapse, and its enemies would sweep south with unstoppable force. Yet Ramses showed the courage that had been honed since his youth. He rode directly into the chaos, rallying troops, reorganizing broken lines, and striking fear into the enemy with his presence. Soldiers later spoke of him as a figure of almost divine power, wielding courage like a weapon, appearing where the battle was fiercest, inspiring confidence even in moments of near despair. The fighting was relentless. Arrows darkened the sky, chariots collided, horses screamed, and dust turned the air into a thick, choking fog. Ramses' elite division became surrounded, cut off from the main body of his army. For a moment, the pharaoh was trapped, facing enemies on all sides. Many historians believe that in this instant, Egypt could have faced total collapse, yet Ramses did not hesitate. With decisive action, he broke through the encirclement, striking directly at the Hittite leaders. His daring maneuver prevented catastrophe and gave the Egyptians a fighting chance to regroup. Even with this dramatic turn, the battle remained precarious. Supplies were stretched thin. Reinforcements from other divisions were delayed. The Hittites pressed their advantage, striking again and again. Every minute, Ramses had to make split-second decisions, balancing aggression with caution, offense with defense. The weight of command rested entirely on his shoulders. One mistake, one hesitation, one miscalculation, and Egypt could have suffered a catastrophic defeat. During this chaos, Ramses' personal bravery became legendary. He rode through enemy lines, striking with precision, rallying troops who were wavering, and showing no fear, even when surrounded. Soldiers later recounted that they could not believe a single man, a pharaoh, could inspire such courage amid total chaos. His presence turned the tide psychologically, giving his army hope and determination when all seemed lost. But the battle was far from over. The Hittites, realizing that the Egyptian forces were being reorganized, pressed harder, sending elite chariots into the flanks. Ramses again demonstrated his tactical genius, personally redirecting troops to critical positions and launching counterattacks. It was a delicate dance of life and death, where timing, instinct, and sheer will determined survival. The outcome of the battle remains one of history's most debated mysteries. The Egyptians claimed victory, while Hittite records suggest it was a stalemate. Yet one thing is clear: Ramses survived near annihilation, turned potential disaster into opportunity, and emerged with his reputation strengthened as a fearless and strategic leader. This battle, chaotic and unpredictable, revealed the pharaoh's most defining qualities: courage under pressure, rapid decision-making, and the ability to inspire loyalty even when the odds were overwhelming. Imagine standing on that plain, the sun burning your back, dust choking your lungs, arrows flying past your head, and knowing that the survival of an empire rests on the courage of one man. Could you maintain your composure? Could you make life-or-death decisions while chaos reigns around you? Ramses did. And in doing so, he created the legend of Kadesh that would echo for millennia. Yet the battle left scars beyond the battlefield. Thousands of men were dead or wounded. Families mourned sons and brothers. Cities along the border remained tense, knowing that the threat of the Hittites was far from gone. Ramses understood that victory in the field was only part of his responsibility. Maintaining the empire required diplomacy, negotiation, and the constant projection of power. Kadesh taught him that warfare was not only about bravery and weapons, but also about perception, timing, and the ability to turn even near defeat into a symbol of strength. This battle also shaped Ramses' psyche as a leader. He learned the fragility of even the most meticulously planned campaigns. He understood the importance of anticipating enemy movements, of never underestimating the cunning of opponents, and of maintaining absolute control over morale. Kadesh was more than a battle. It was a crucible, one that tested not only military skill, but the endurance, courage, and intelligence that would define his reign. After Kadesh, Ramses returned to Egypt with a story that would inspire awe. Monuments were erected, inscriptions were carved, and the pharaoh's heroism was celebrated. But beneath the public triumph lay the reality of near catastrophe, the fear and the chaos that he had navigated with unparalleled skill. This was the battle that turned a young pharaoh into a legend, teaching him lessons that would influence every campaign, treaty, and decision for the rest of his life. And yet, even with the victory at Kadesh, the question remained: could Ramses maintain this dominance for decades? The Hittites were not vanquished, internal pressures persisted, and every campaign carried the risk of disaster. The true measure of his greatness would not be one battle, but the decades of rule that followed, where every challenge, every threat, and every decision would define Egypt and etch his name permanently into history. After the chaos and near disaster of Kadesh, Ramses II returned to Egypt, not just as a survivor, but as a ruler transformed. The battlefield had tested his courage, his strategy, and his instinct for leadership, but now a new challenge awaited. Victory in war was only the beginning. To secure Egypt's borders, strengthen his legacy, and ensure the empire's survival, Ramses would need to wield diplomacy with as much precision as a sword. The Hittites were still a formidable threat. Kadesh had not broken them, it had only delayed them. Both empires had suffered losses, yet neither could claim decisive victory. Ramses understood that brute force alone would not guarantee Egypt's security. If he wished to leave a lasting mark, he needed to transform hostility into stability. It was time to negotiate, to manipulate alliances, and to wield treaties as instruments of power. Egypt's northern territories were volatile. Cities along the Levantine coast had long been torn between the influence of the Hittites and the Egyptians. Local rulers were opportunistic, shifting allegiance according to which empire seemed stronger at any given moment. Ramses recognized that to maintain control, he needed to inspire confidence, not fear alone. A single uprising could unravel months of careful preparation. His presence, diplomacy, and sometimes sheer intimidation had to convince these leaders that Egypt would not falter again. Ramses' first step was to display continued strength. Even after Kadesh, he personally led military campaigns to show that Egypt's army remained formidable. This wasn't just about conquest, it was psychological warfare. The Hittites and rebellious city-states needed to see a pharaoh who could recover from near defeat and turn chaos into order. By moving decisively, Ramses sent a clear message: Egypt's power was unshakable, and its pharaoh could not be underestimated. At the same time, he began forging alliances. Neighboring kingdoms, impressed by his resilience and cautious of Hittite ambitions, were invited into treaties. Egypt offered protection, trade benefits, and recognition in exchange for loyalty. Ramses understood a key principle of leadership: war is temporary, but alliances can secure centuries. By weaving a web of diplomatic influence, he created a buffer zone, giving Egypt both breathing room and strategic depth. But diplomacy was not simple. Every envoy, every message, every negotiation had to balance subtle threats with promises of reward. Ramses' reputation for courage helped, but he knew that enemies often tested the pharaoh's patience and resolve. One false word, one misinterpreted gesture could spark rebellion or provoke Hittite retaliation. Every treaty had to be carefully worded, every handshake carefully timed, every promise backed by the silent threat of overwhelming force. Meanwhile, Ramses also focused on internal consolidation. Generals, governors, and officials were scrutinized. Loyalty was demanded, but it was also cultivated. Rewards were given to those who proved faithful, and disloyalty was punished swiftly and publicly. Egypt's bureaucracy was strengthened under the pharaoh's watchful eye. He understood that the strength of the empire was not just in armies and weapons, it was in organization, intelligence, and control. Ramses' architectural projects also served as instruments of power. Temples, statues, and inscriptions were not only religious or artistic, they were political statements. By building monumental structures along borders and in strategic cities, Ramses projected authority. These monuments conveyed a message to both allies and enemies. Egypt was eternal, the pharaoh was divine, and resistance was futile. Every carving of Ramses in battle, every depiction of him in the company of gods, reinforced his image as a ruler ordained by destiny itself. Even family politics were instrumental in securing his reign. Ramses married strategically, aligning himself with key families to strengthen loyalty. His children were placed in positions of influence, ensuring continuity and stability. These alliances were not born of affection alone. They were calculated moves to cement power across Egypt and neighboring territories. Ramses understood that the foundation of empire lay as much in personal relationships as it did in military might. Yet the tension never fully lifted. The Hittites remained a constant shadow, their armies regrouping, their spies active, and their leaders patient. Ramses knew that any sign of weakness could invite renewed aggression. Every march, every treaty, every diplomatic maneuver carried the weight of potential war. His life, the lives of his soldiers, and the stability of Egypt depended on vigilance, intelligence, and the ability to anticipate threats before they arrived. Ramses' approach to diplomacy also reflected his understanding of perception. Even minor victories or symbolic gestures were magnified to create an image of unbroken strength. Public celebrations, festivals, and military parades reminded the people and the world that Egypt's pharaoh was unassailable. In this way, Ramses used spectacle as strategy, turning every act of governance into an assertion of power and legitimacy. By the end of these campaigns, Ramses achieved something remarkable, a balance between war and diplomacy that few rulers ever mastered. He had secured borders through both force and negotiation, cultivated loyalty through rewards and fear, and strengthened the empire's internal structure. His legacy was no longer just about battlefield heroics. It was about the enduring stability of Egypt, achieved through intelligence, strategy, and relentless leadership. The lessons of Kadesh and the subsequent campaigns would guide Ramses for decades. He had seen firsthand the fragility of empires, the cunning of enemies, and the consequences of miscalculation. But he had also discovered the power of resilience, the strategic advantage of perception, and the enduring strength of a ruler who could combine courage, diplomacy, and foresight in ways that shaped history. And so, Egypt entered a period of relative stability and expanded influence. Ramses II had not only survived near annihilation on the battlefield, but had turned those experiences into tools of governance, ensuring that the empire would endure and thrive for decades. He was no longer just a pharaoh who commanded armies. He was a master of strategy, diplomacy, and legacy, a ruler who understood that true power lies in securing both the loyalty of your people and the respect of your enemies. The question remained, could Ramses maintain this delicate balance for the rest of his long reign? Could he continue to outmaneuver enemies, consolidate power, and leave a legacy that would outlive even the monuments he built? The story of Ramses II was far from over, and the world would soon witness how he answered these questions through both triumph and sacrifice. Ramses II understood that true power is not measured merely by the size of your army or the reach of your borders. Power is measured by permanence, the ability to make your presence felt long after your breath leaves this world. And so he turned his gaze to stone, to monuments, and to a legacy carved in eternity. From the moment he ascended the throne, Ramses envisioned Egypt as a kingdom where his name would echo through the ages. Temples, obelisks, colossal statues, every project was designed to awe, to intimidate, and to immortalize. To the people, these monuments were signs of piety and devotion to the gods. To neighboring kingdoms, they were warnings. Egypt was unstoppable, its pharaoh both mortal and divine. Abu Simbel, perhaps his most famous creation, was more than a temple. It was a declaration of power, carved directly from mountains. 4 colossal statues of Ramses himself dominated the facade, each more than 20 meters tall. Soldiers marching past, merchants visiting the city, and diplomats traveling from afar would all be confronted with the same message. This man is Pharaoh, and his will shapes the very earth itself. The interior chambers, adorned with intricate reliefs of battles, divine blessings, and royal triumphs, told the story of a ruler who could defy gods and mortals alike. Even in his monuments, Ramses merged history with propaganda. Reliefs depicted him as victorious at Kadesh, striking down enemies single-handedly, even when the historical reality had been far more complex. Every chisel stroke, every image reinforced his image as invincible. To the people, the stories were both awe-inspiring and instructive. Loyalty to the pharaoh was loyalty to Egypt itself, and the pharaoh's enemies would be crushed. Ramses' obsession with immortality extended to smaller statues and inscriptions scattered throughout cities and temples. No corner of Egypt was left untouched. Everywhere, his likeness and his deeds were visible, ensuring that the pharaoh's presence would remain in the hearts and minds of Egyptians for centuries. Even after death, Ramses planned to dominate the land, his monuments serving as silent witnesses to his greatness. And yet, not all monuments were purely for vanity. They had strategic value as well. Temples often served as centers of administration, collecting taxes, redistributing goods, and monitoring local populations. Statues and inscriptions reinforced the pharaoh's authority, reminding governors and officials that Egypt was unified under one divinely sanctioned ruler. Power, in Ramses' vision, was inseparable from its perception, and nothing broadcast authority like stone and gold. The monuments also reflected Ramses' relationship with the gods. Every temple aligned with celestial events, every depiction emphasized divine favor, and every offering ritual reaffirmed his role as Egypt's intermediary with the gods. He did not just build for the living, he built to impress eternity itself, leaving a record that the gods would recognize, and through that recognition grant legitimacy to his rule. Even the locations of these monuments were chosen with meticulous care. Abu Simbel, on Egypt's southern frontier, was a message to Nubia. Egypt was strong, eternal, and ever watchful. Temples along the Nile reinforced control of trade routes, ensuring that the pharaoh's presence was felt not only spiritually, but economically and politically. Every stone placement was a calculated act of governance, disguised as devotion. Ramses' legacy was also woven into art and culture. Stories of his battles, wisdom, and divine connections were inscribed in reliefs, recited in temples, and taught in schools. These narratives shaped the Egyptian consciousness, creating generations who revered their pharaoh as a living god, a warrior king, and a master of destiny. The monuments were more than stone; they were lessons, propaganda, and inspiration, all rolled into one. But the most striking element was the scale. Ramses II ruled for 66 years, long enough to see projects through from conception to completion. His vision spanned decades, and few rulers in history have had the opportunity to imprint themselves so fully upon the land they governed. Obelisks were erected, statues carved, and temples completed at a pace that astounded contemporaries. For the Egyptians, the pharaoh was omnipresent. For the world, he was larger than life. Even with all this grandeur, Ramses's ambition sometimes bordered on obsession. Some projects demanded enormous manpower, resources, and sacrifices from ordinary Egyptians. Laborers, artisans, and soldiers were mobilized for decades to realize the pharaoh's vision. While many praised the resulting monuments, the cost was immense, both in human toil and economic strain. Ramses' desire for immortality was not without consequence, yet perhaps this was precisely the point. Immortality, Ramses understood, requires sacrifice on the part of the ruler and the ruled. His monuments were more than art or propaganda. They were a statement that Egypt's greatness required commitment, endurance, and obedience. Every temple, statue, and relief reinforced the idea that the pharaoh's authority was eternal, absolute, and unchallengeable. And still, despite the magnificence of Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, and countless other projects, Ramses never lost sight of the battlefield. Monuments were a reflection of his power, but power itself was maintained through strategy, diplomacy, and military might. His stones told the story he wanted the world to see. But the reality of ruling, managing armies, borders, and alliances remained as challenging as ever. By the time the grandest monuments were completed, Ramses II had ensured that his image would outlive him. Generations would marvel at the scale, the artistry, and the ambition. But the true genius lay not only in the stones themselves, but in how he used them to shape perception, command loyalty, and secure Egypt's place in history. He had mastered both the tangible and the psychological aspects of power, and yet a shadow always lingered. Despite all the grandeur, Egypt's enemies were never fully gone, internal dissent still simmered, and the pharaoh's long life was a double-edged sword. How would he maintain dominance, protect his borders, and ensure his legacy against the inevitable tests that awaited? The monuments could stand forever, but could Ramses himself withstand the challenges that history still had in store? Ramses II was more than a warrior and builder. He was a father, husband, and a man whose family life was as strategically important as his battles or monuments. In the palace, every relationship was a layer of politics. every marriage a calculated alliance, every child a potential heir. Behind the gold and splendor of Egypt's court lay a web of personal intrigue, ambition and subtle tension. Ramses married over a dozen women, yet his primary queen, Nefertari, held a special place. She was celebrated not only for her beauty, but for her political significance. Through Nefertari, Ramses strengthened alliances with key families, consolidated loyalty among high-ranking officials, and sent a message to the empire. The pharaoh's household was a center of power as much as the battlefield. Their partnership was both romantic and strategic, a delicate balance where affection and authority intertwined. Every child born to Ramses carried weight. Sons were trained from birth to inherit authority, to command armies, and to understand the complex machinery of governance. Daughters were married off strategically, forming alliances that extended Egypt's influence. But behind this political design, there were real human struggles. Ramses had to navigate jealousy, rivalry, and favoritism among wives and children. The palace, grand and magnificent, was also a place of tension, where love and ambition collided daily. One son, often overshadowed by his older siblings, became a symbol of the delicate balance between affection and duty. Ramses had to ensure the boy felt both loved and prepared for responsibility. Every lesson in statecraft, every inspection of military drills, was also a subtle test. Could this child survive the pressures of royalty? Could he inherit not only the throne, but the burdens of an empire that demanded perfection? Even Nefertari faced challenges. In a world where influence was power, rival queens and concubines constantly sought to elevate their own children. Jealousy simmered in the corridors, whispered accusations and subtle maneuvers shaped the dynamics of the palace. Nefertari's ability to maintain favor, protect her children, and support Ramses's agenda was a testament to her intelligence, courage, and resilience. She was not just a consort, she was a partner in power. Ramses's own life was deeply affected by these family dynamics. Decisions made in private chambers had consequences that echoed across the empire. A misstep in succession planning could spark rebellion. A quarrel among heirs could destabilize alliances forged over decades. The pharaoh had to navigate these treacherous waters with the same precision he applied to battle, balancing personal feelings with the demands of rule. Despite these pressures, Ramses cultivated deep bonds with his family. He celebrated festivals, attended religious ceremonies, and ensured that his children understood both the privilege and the responsibility of their lineage. Yet even love was never simple. Every act of care was entwined with duty, every expression of affection measured against its impact on politics, succession, and public perception. The pharaoh could not allow personal preference to override the stability of Egypt. The stakes were never abstract. Sons grew up under constant scrutiny, their education, play, and training all intertwined with the needs of statecraft. Mistakes were not forgiven lightly. Weakness could be exploited by rivals both inside and outside the palace. Every achievement was celebrated, every failure magnified. Ramses' household was a crucible, producing heirs capable of leading an empire or exposing it to chaos. And yet, amid this structure, human emotion persisted. Children feared displeasing their father. Wives navigated alliances with subtlety and grace. Ramses himself experienced the tension between personal attachment and duty. The grandeur of his reign could not shield him from the anxiety that each decision carried the weight of generations, that each family interaction could influence the stability of Egypt. Even diplomacy intersected with family. Marriages arranged for political gain also tested loyalty and personal bonds. Ramses' daughters were sent to neighboring kingdoms as symbols of alliance, their lives intertwined with the fate of empires. The pharaoh had to balance affection for his children with the harsh reality of statecraft. Each union was a calculated risk, promising loyalty but potentially creating resentment or intrigue. And the drama was not confined to the living. Ancestors and legacy haunted every decision. Ramses had to honor traditions, respect the memory of predecessors, and reinforce the divinity of the pharaoh's role. Every family gathering, every public celebration was an opportunity to demonstrate continuity, strength, and legitimacy. The weight of history rested on him, not just as a ruler but as a father, husband, and patriarch. Through all this, Ramses demonstrated a rare ability. He could blend personal life and politics without losing control. The pharaoh was able to inspire loyalty among family, navigate rivalry, and ensure succession plans while maintaining a formidable presence both on the battlefield and in the palace. He understood that family was not just personal, it was an extension of the state. Every love, rivalry, and alliance within the palace affected the stability of Egypt itself. And yet, even with careful planning, the palace was not without peril. The ambitions of heirs, the scheming of rivals, and the unpredictability of human emotion meant that Ramses' family life was a battlefield in its own right, one where strategy, intuition, and emotional intelligence were just as crucial as military skill. Could he maintain order and loyalty within the palace while projecting power across the empire? The answer would define not just his reign, but the legacy of Egypt for generations. As the pharaoh's children grew, and as alliances expanded through marriage and diplomacy, the palace became a stage where personal drama and political calculation merged. Ramses had to navigate this daily theater with skill, courage, and foresight, ensuring that both family and empire thrived under his guidance. And yet, a question lingered like a shadow over the gilded halls. Could even Ramses, the living god-king, truly control the ambitions and emotions of those closest to him? Could he secure his legacy without being undone by the very people he loved most? The answers would unfold in the years to come, shaping the fate of Egypt and the dynasty of one of history's greatest pharaohs. Ramses II had survived Kadesh, secured his borders through diplomacy, and carved his image into stone, yet his reign was far from finished. The empire still faced threats from rebellious territories, ambitious neighbors, and the ever-present challenge of maintaining Egypt's dominance. By the second and third decades of his rule, Ramses understood that the sword remained as important as the monument. Expansion, discipline, and strategy would define the later years of his reign. The northern borders along the Levant remained volatile. Cities often shifted allegiances depending on which empire seemed stronger. Ramses could not allow uncertainty to spread. Every city he conquered or pacified became both a military victory and a psychological message. He approached each campaign with precision, balancing brute force with calculated intimidation. In every march, he combined intelligence reports, logistics, and psychological tactics to outmaneuver opponents before the first clash of swords. Ramses' campaigns in Nubia and along the eastern borders further demonstrated his ability to blend showmanship with strategy. In Nubia, he led forces to secure trade routes and protect valuable resources. Here, victory required both discipline and diplomacy. Rebels were given choices: submission or annihilation. His campaigns often involved dramatic displays of strength, large processions of chariots, showy parades, and impressive formations to convince enemies that Egypt's power was unchallengeable. These campaigns weren't just about land, they were about perception. A rival could be defeated without battle if fear was established first. But war was never simple. Ramses faced treacherous terrain, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of ambush. In the deserts and river valleys, he relied on scouts and intelligence networks to anticipate enemy movements. Supply lines had to be guarded, troops motivated, and local leaders placated. Any misstep could lead to disaster, turning a seemingly minor rebellion into a catastrophic loss. Ramses' ability to maintain cohesion under these pressures became legendary, inspiring loyalty among his generals and fear among his enemies. Even with his military brilliance, Ramses faced moments of near catastrophe. In one campaign, a hidden force nearly encircled his troops. Arrows rained down, chariots collided, and chaos threatened to engulf the Egyptian army. The pharaoh rode into the storm, rallying his men and personally leading a counterattack that turned potential defeat into triumph. Soldiers later spoke of him as a figure of divine intervention, a man who could appear in the deadliest moments and alter the course of history. Beyond the battlefield, Ramses skillfully leveraged alliances, diplomacy and marriage intertwined with military strategy. He often sent envoys to neighboring kingdoms, blending threats with promises of wealth and security. Territories that had once wavered now pledged loyalty. In this way, Ramses expanded Egypt's influence without shedding blood in every instance, proving that a successful ruler must master both war and negotiation. The pharaoh also innovated in military organization. Chariots became faster, more agile, and better coordinated. Infantry units were drilled to execute complex maneuvers under extreme pressure. Archers were positioned strategically to maximize their effect, while cavalry patrolled vulnerable borders. Ramses' campaigns were rehearsed like military symphonies, each unit playing its part to perfection. Even minor adjustments in strategy could lead to overwhelming advantage, and Ramses' eye for detail ensured that his army remained disciplined, flexible, and deadly. Yet not all victories were decisive. Some campaigns were drawn out, marked by skirmishes and shifting allegiances. Ramses learned that persistence often mattered more than sheer strength. Patience, timing, and psychological pressure became as critical as force of arms. Repeatedly, he demonstrated the ability to endure, adapt, and exploit the weaknesses of his opponents. Each campaign reinforced his reputation as a pharaoh who could withstand setbacks, recalibrate, and ultimately triumph. Amid these successes, Ramses' personal bravery remained central. He often led from the front, placing himself where danger was greatest. His presence inspired troops and terrified enemies, establishing a legend that would endure for centuries. Soldiers believed that as long as Ramses rode with them, no obstacle was insurmountable. This combination of leadership, courage, and calculated strategy became a hallmark of his later campaigns. But even victories came with costs. Every battle claimed lives, drained resources, and tested the loyalty of commanders. Ramses had to constantly manage not only the enemy, but also the internal dynamics of his army. Rival generals, ambitious princes, and ambitious officials all had to be kept in check. Failure to do so could result in rebellion, desertion, or political sabotage. The pharaoh's genius was not merely in defeating enemies, but in balancing power within his own ranks. By the later decades of his reign, Ramses had expanded Egypt's influence further than any of his predecessors. His campaigns secured key trade routes, pacified rebellious regions, and demonstrated the relentless power of the pharaoh. But perhaps more importantly, these campaigns reinforced the myth of Ramses as a living god, a ruler whose courage, intelligence, and strategy could shape the destiny of nations. And yet, even with decades of victories behind him, questions loomed. Could Ramses maintain this dominance as he aged? Could the empire endure the inevitable challenges of succession, rebellion, and external threats? Could a man, no matter how brilliant, hold together a kingdom so vast and complex for nearly 7 decades? The answers would not come easily, and the next chapters of his reign would test not only his skill, but his resilience, his vision, and his ability to turn history itself in Egypt's favor. By the middle of his reign, Ramses II had proven himself a master of war, diplomacy, and monument building, but he understood that the true power of a pharaoh extended far beyond armies or stone. Power was as much about perception as it was about force, and in ancient Egypt, perception was intertwined with the divine. Ramses was not just a ruler, he was a god walking among mortals, a living bridge between the heavens and the Nile. From the very first day of his reign, the pharaoh cultivated this image with meticulous care. Every temple ceremony, every festival, every religious ritual reinforced the idea that Ramses was chosen by the gods to rule. Priests praised him as a divine intermediary, statues depicted him receiving blessings from Ra, Amun, and Pa. Even minor inscriptions framed him as a figure who acted with the authority of the gods, making every decision sacred, every victory preordained. Religion was not only a matter of ceremony, it was a tool of governance. By presenting himself as divine, Ramses commanded loyalty not just from soldiers or officials, but from every citizen. Disobedience was no longer merely political rebellion, it became sacrilege, a challenge to the gods themselves. This perception gave him extraordinary control. Even distant governors, far from the capital, recognized that opposition to Ramses was opposition to cosmic order itself. Temples were central to this strategy. They were not just places of worship, they were stages for demonstrating divine favor. Ramses ensured that rituals celebrated his victories, depicted his relationships with gods, and showcased his role as Egypt's protector. At Karnak and Luxor, massive statues and reliefs immortalized these narratives, blending religion, propaganda, and artistry into a powerful statement. The pharaoh was both human and god, mortal and eternal. Yet this divine image carried a heavy personal burden. Ramses was constantly aware that every action would be scrutinized, not just for political or military consequences, but for its spiritual significance. A failed campaign, a rebellion, or a diplomatic misstep could be interpreted as a sign of divine disfavor. The pharaoh had to maintain perfection, not only in governance but in the eyes of the gods. This pressure was relentless, a silent weight that no monument could relieve. Even the rituals themselves were intensely personal. Ramses would participate in ceremonies that required absolute presence and discipline. Hours spent performing intricate rites, offering prayers and observing astrological alignments were more than religious acts. They were demonstrations of commitment, skill, and authority. The people witnessed these performances and believed that their pharaoh's divine connection ensured Egypt's stability and prosperity. The pharaoh also understood the psychological power of symbols. Crowns, scepters, ceremonial attire, all were carefully designed to reinforce his godlike image. In public appearances, Ramses' presence was theatrical, commanding awe and respect. Every gesture, every word, every smile or frown reinforced the narrative of his divinity. To challenge him was to challenge cosmic order itself, a risk that few dared take. But the human side of this divinity was never far from reality. Behind the rituals and symbols was a man aware of mortality, conscious of rivals, and attentive to the ambitions of his own family. The same children, whose marriages cemented political alliances, were also the heirs who would inherit the sacred mantle. Every decision about succession carried spiritual weight as well as political consequence. One wrong move could weaken the perception of divine authority and invite rebellion. Ramses had to navigate these tensions carefully, balancing personal emotion, family loyalty, and the demands of godhood. The pharaoh's devotion to religion also reinforced his military campaigns. Battles were framed as divine mandates. Victories were celebrated as proof that the gods favored Egypt and its ruler. Kadesh, Abu Simbel, and later campaigns were not only strategic or political, they were sacred acts. Soldiers fought not just for territory, but for the pharaoh who embodied divine power. This perception inspired extraordinary loyalty and bravery, even in moments of extreme danger. Yet there was a shadow beneath this brilliance. As Ramses aged, maintaining the illusion of perfection became increasingly difficult. Time began to show on his body. Rivals and courtiers watched closely for signs of weakness. Illness, fatigue, or miscalculation could tarnish the carefully constructed image of divine authority. The pharaoh's later years would test whether godhood was a mantle that could truly withstand the relentless pressures of human life. Even the monuments and inscriptions meant to immortalize him could not fully protect Ramses from the challenges of mortality. Divine or not, he remained a man, subject to age, politics, and the unpredictable tides of history. Maintaining Egypt's stability, commanding armies, guiding his family, and projecting divine authority simultaneously was a feat few rulers could hope to achieve. And yet Ramses did it for decades, forging a reign that would be remembered as one of the longest and most successful in human history. Still, questions lingered. Could the pharaoh maintain his divine image as he entered old age? Could the perception of godhood hold when advisors plotted, rivals watched, and borders remained restless? Could he inspire the same awe in soldiers and citizens alike when the hands that once wielded the scepter and sword began to tremble? The stage was set, and the next chapters of Ramses' reign would reveal whether a man who claimed divinity could truly withstand the passage of time and the relentless demands of empire. By the 5th decade of his reign, Ramses II had become a legend. His victories, monuments, and divine image were known across Egypt and far beyond. But even the greatest pharaoh is not immune to the relentless passage of time. Age began to leave its mark, physically, politically, and emotionally. The hand that once commanded armies with flawless precision began to tremble. The eyes that had scouted battlefields and inspected monuments now occasionally betrayed fatigue, and everywhere he turned, challenges awaited. For centuries, Ramses had projected strength. Soldiers, officials, and neighboring rulers believed in the invincibility of the pharaoh. But time changes perception. Advisors whispered doubts. Generals once loyal began to test limits. Younger princes and ambitious officials eyed power, calculating how they might gain advantage once Ramses could no longer maintain the delicate balance of fear, loyalty, and awe. Even a man who had declared himself divine could not entirely escape the human vulnerability of age. The aging pharaoh faced rivals both within and outside his family. Sons jostled for positions, eager to cement their authority, each subtly undermining the other. Daughters' marriages, once instruments of alliance, became points of tension as families leveraged influence against each other. The palace, always a center of political intrigue, became more dangerous as the shadows of ambition grew longer. Every decision carried weight. One misstep, and decades of stability could unravel. Physical challenges mirrored political ones. Campaigns that once required vigor and stamina now demanded extraordinary effort to maintain. Ramses continued to lead, but he increasingly relied on trusted generals to execute strategies he had once commanded directly. Every victory became a delicate collaboration between experience, planning, and the loyalty of men who could sense the pharaoh's slowing pace. Even with decades of command behind him, the reality of age was inescapable. Yet Ramses' brilliance did not diminish. He adapted. Where once he had led chariots into battle, he now became a master of delegation, foresight, and psychological strategy. He understood that his legend, the perception of godhood, invincibility, and wisdom, was as crucial as any sword. Advisors and soldiers alike followed not only out of loyalty, but out of reverence for the pharaoh who had survived wars, Kadesh, and decades of governance. His image, carefully cultivated through monuments, religion, and ceremony, continued to inspire fear and devotion. Still, the strain of ruling an empire for over 6 decades left scars. The pressures of leadership, the responsibilities of family, and the relentless vigilance required to maintain dominance took an emotional toll. Ramses was aware that the empire he had built could falter if he failed to manage even the smallest details: supplies, loyalties, succession, and perception. Age magnified every potential flaw, and the pharaoh's personal courage was tested daily. Internal rivals posed constant danger. Ambitious generals might exploit minor setbacks to claim authority. Corrupt officials threatened to destabilize cities. Even ceremonial failures could be interpreted as signs of divine disfavor. Ramses had to remain vigilant, balancing stern punishment with political cunning. One wrong move, and whispers of weakness could spread, inspiring rebellion in borderlands or sedition in the heart of Egypt. And yet, for all the political intrigue, Ramses found moments of reflection. In the quiet of the palace, among the temples and monuments he had built, he considered the impermanence of life and the enduring weight of legacy. Every stone, every relief, every ritual he had orchestrated was a bid against mortality, a defiance of time itself. But even monuments could not shield him from the intimate pressures of family, rivalry, and aging. The human cost of immortality was always present, reminding the pharaoh that power, no matter how absolute, is never free of sacrifice. As Ramses aged, the question of succession loomed large. His sons, trained and prepared, were expected to inherit the throne seamlessly, yet personal ambition and familial tension made smooth transition uncertain. Each heir was a potential ally and a potential threat. Ramses had to manage these dynamics with the same precision he once applied to campaigns, balancing loyalty with discipline and love with authority. The weight of the empire rested on his ability to navigate both human emotion and political reality. Even the perception of godhood became more fragile with age. The people, accustomed to a pharaoh of unmatched vitality, could not ignore the signs of time. Festivals, rituals, and ceremonies became tools to maintain the illusion of perfection, yet Ramses knew that time spared no man. Every gesture, every ritual performance was now not only an act of devotion, but also an act of survival, protecting the empire by projecting unyielding authority, even as his body aged. And then there were the enemies beyond Egypt's borders. Rivals, ever watchful, waited for signs of weakness. Hittites, Libyans, and Nubians all observed the aging pharaoh, calculating how to exploit the slightest lapse. Ramses had long understood that the battlefield extended beyond swords and chariots. Perception and timing were as lethal as any army. Maintaining dominance required constant vigilance, and aging only intensified the stakes. The later years of Ramses' reign became a delicate dance between strength and vulnerability, loyalty and ambition, human frailty and divine image. Every decision was a test of experience, intuition, and foresight. Could he continue to protect Egypt's borders, manage his family, and maintain the perception of godhood against the relentless passage of time? Could a man who had survived decades of war, intrigue, and political maneuvering endure the ultimate battle against his own mortality? The answer would define not just the remaining years of his reign, but the legacy of Egypt itself. Ramses's later campaigns, family management, and religious authority were all under pressure, and even the mightiest pharaoh could not take his empire's stability for granted. Every day was a test, every interaction a potential threat, and every decision a step toward either continued greatness or fragile decline. And yet, despite all the challenges, Ramses' presence remained commanding. Soldiers still revered him, priests still invoked his name, and citizens still looked to him as the living embodiment of Egypt's strength. His genius was in enduring, adapting to age, balancing rivals, and managing perception with the precision of a master strategist. But the question lingered: would even Ramses, the legendary pharaoh, survive the trials of his final decades unscathed, or would time finally claim the man who had conquered history itself? By the final decades of his reign, Ramses II had achieved what few rulers in human history could even imagine. Egypt's borders were secure, its cities prosperous, and its monuments unrivaled. Yet even as he walked among the temples, gazed upon his statues, and inspected the lands he had conquered, he understood that legacy is a complex force. It is not measured in victories alone, but in memory, perception, and endurance. Ramses' legacy was visible everywhere. Monuments stretched along the Nile, their massive stones bearing his likeness, inscriptions proclaiming his victories, and reliefs depicting the pharaoh as both warrior and god. Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, all were testaments to his ambition, engineering skill, and desire to be remembered. Generations who would never know him personally would still see his image, hear his story, and feel the shadow of his power. Yet the monuments were more than just vanity. They were instruments of memory. Each temple, each colossal statue, was designed to communicate Egypt's greatness, the pharaoh's divinity, and the permanence of order. Ramses understood that empires do not survive on strength alone. they survive through stories, symbols, and the perception of continuity. He had transformed Egypt itself into a living archive, a nation whose walls, stones, and statues would speak long after his death. But legacy is never purely public. It is also intimate, carried in the lives of children, family, and successors. Ramses' sons and daughters were central to this plan. Their marriages, alliances, and training ensured that his dynasty would remain secure. Each child was a living extension of the pharaoh's will, a continuation of his influence, yet this too carried risk. Generational ambition, rivalries among heirs, and the unpredictability of human emotion meant that even legacy could be fragile. A dynasty, no matter how carefully planned, could unravel in the wrong hands. Ramses also understood the fragility of memory. Time erodes, empires fall, and monuments crumble. He knew that his image needed constant reinforcement, not just through stone, but through stories, rituals, and religion. Priests celebrated his achievements, scribes recorded his deeds, and festivals enshrined his victories in the consciousness of the people. Memory, in Ramses' hands, became a weapon as powerful as any army, a way to influence the present and shape the future. Yet for all his accomplishments, Ramses' legacy was not without contradiction. His monuments celebrated victory, but they often concealed hardship: the laborers who built them, the soldiers who fought in distant lands, and the citizens whose lives were directed by the pharaoh's will. His reign was golden, but its foundation was also built on sacrifice. History remembers glory, it rarely records the pain behind it. Ramses' legacy was monumental, but human cost was inseparable from the grandeur. Even in death, Ramses's planning for eternity reflected his brilliance. Tombs, inscriptions, and mortuary temples were carefully constructed to protect his memory and spirit. His mummy would lie in state, surrounded by rituals ensuring divine protection. Every detail was designed to communicate power beyond the grave, to make Egypt itself a stage where his presence would endure. In a way, Ramses became larger than life, not just through deeds or monuments, but through the stories, rituals, and collective memory he orchestrated. But legacy is not only about what survives, it is also about what is interpreted. Future generations would see Ramses through the lens of their own culture, politics, and imagination. Some would see a godlike ruler, others a ruthless strategist. Some would marvel at the monuments, others question the human cost behind them. Ramses understood this implicitly. History would not be controlled entirely by stone. Memory is fluid, shaped by storytellers, scholars, and rulers long after the pharaoh has gone. Even in his lifetime, Ramses shaped his legacy through diplomacy. The famous peace treaty with the Hittites was not only a strategic move, but also a symbolic act. By framing Egypt as both dominant and just, he ensured that history would remember him as both a warrior and a wise statesman. His legacy was as much about perception abroad as it was at home. Every alliance, every treaty, every ceremony contributed to the enduring image of Ramses II as a ruler without equal. And yet, despite all his planning, Ramses faced the ultimate uncertainty: mortality. Every monument, every son, every ritual was a hedge against time, but no man can truly escape death. The pharaoh knew that one day his body would fade, his voice would be silenced, and even his monuments could erode. His genius lay in transforming this inevitability into a story of triumph. Through memory, religion, and monumental artistry, Ramses carved a version of immortality for himself and for Egypt. By the end of his reign, Egypt had not only survived but thrived under a ruler who balanced ambition, diplomacy, warfare, and faith. Ramses II had become more than a king. He had become a symbol, an idea, a legend that transcended mortality. Yet within this greatness there was a human story of ambition, family, sacrifice, and resilience. The monuments, campaigns, and religious rituals were the visible expression of a life lived under extraordinary pressure, where personal and political mastery intertwined with a vision of eternity. And so Ramses' legacy is both inspiring and cautionary. It reminds us that power, when wielded with brilliance, can shape civilizations. But it also reminds us of the personal cost, the labor, the conflict, the relentless vigilance required to maintain empire. His memory endures, not only in stone and history, but in the lessons of ambition, strategy, and the human desire for immortality. Even today, walking among the ruins of Abu Simbel or Karnak, one feels the weight of a man who lived, fought, and ruled with a vision that spanned decades. Ramses II achieved what few mortals can. He became eternal. Yet in the shadow of his greatness, one question lingers. Could any legacy truly survive the erosion of time, or is immortality only an illusion, preserved in memory and story? After more than 6 decades of rule, the inevitable moment arrived. Ramses II, the living god-king, the conqueror, the builder, the father, and the strategist, took his final breath. Egypt, the empire he had shaped, defended, and elevated, stood still. The Nile, witness to centuries of triumphs and ceremonies, flowed silently, as if paying respect to a life that had defined a civilization. The news of the pharaoh's death spread swiftly. Courtiers, priests, generals, and common citizens alike were struck by disbelief. Ramses was not merely a ruler, he was a symbol of divine authority, a presence that had anchored the empire. To lose him was to confront the fragility of all human power. People wept openly in streets, temples were draped in black, and ceremonies began almost immediately to honor the man who had been both god and king. Egyptian society had been meticulously organized around Ramses' rule. His death, while expected, sent shockwaves through every level of governance. Advisors and officials had to step into roles previously defined by his command. Generals, who had relied on his strategic brilliance in battle, now faced the uncertainty of leadership without the guiding hand of their pharaoh. Cities braced themselves, knowing that borders would now be tested, both by external threats and the natural instability that follows the passing of a legendary ruler. The royal family experienced both grief and tension. Sons prepared to inherit authority, yet every heir carried their own ambitions, rivalries, and insecurities. Daughters, married into neighboring kingdoms, sent messages of mourning while consolidating alliances, mindful of the delicate balance Ramses had maintained. Within the palace, emotion and strategy collided, grief for the father, husband, and pharaoh, intertwined with calculations of power, succession, and influence. Every decision in those moments could shape the future of the dynasty he had built. Public mourning was elaborate and ritualized. Priests performed complex ceremonies, invoking the gods to guide the pharaoh's soul through the afterlife. Rituals at the Ramesseum and temples across Egypt echoed with chants, hymns, and laments. Citizens poured into the streets, offering sacrifices, chanting prayers, and lighting fires to honor the man who had been both mortal and divine. Even the simplest act of mourning became a statement of loyalty, a testament to the enduring influence of Ramses' image. Ramses' death also reverberated beyond Egypt. Neighboring empires, the Hittites, Nubians, and Libyans, watched cautiously. The man who had led campaigns, brokered alliances, and forged treaties was gone. Rivals sensed potential instability. Could Egypt maintain its dominance without the pharaoh who had projected strength for decades? Could the empire resist rebellion, invasion, or the internal power struggles that often follow the death of a long-reigning monarch? These questions hung in the air like a storm, and the world waited for the first signs of change. Even in death, Ramses' legacy shaped events. His monumental tomb, designed for eternity, became the focal point of rituals and remembrance. Priests and scribes documented his life in intricate detail, recording his campaigns, alliances, family, and divine connections. His mummified body, preserved with care and reverence, would remain a symbol of enduring power. Egyptians believed that through these rituals, the pharaoh's influence could continue to guide the empire even after he had passed into the afterlife. The emotional weight of his passing was immense. Soldiers who had fought under his command remembered the courage he inspired, often speaking of him as a figure who transcended mortal limits. Citizens, who had seen his monuments rise across the land, reflected on a ruler who had embodied Egypt itself, and even adversaries, who had once faced him on battlefields, recognized his genius and the impact of his reign. Ramses had shaped not just Egypt, but the perception of leadership for generations to come. Yet beneath the grandeur of rituals and monuments, there was human grief. Family members mourned privately, experiencing loss beyond the political calculations. Sons who had relied on guidance now faced responsibility. Wives who had shared decades of partnership now confronted the void left by the pharaoh. Priests, generals and citizens alike felt the absence of a leader whose presence had been woven into every aspect of life. Death had humanized a god, reminding all that even legends are mortal. As Egypt mourned, questions of succession and stability became urgent. Who would inherit the throne? How would power be consolidated? Ramses' foresight had prepared the empire for this eventuality, yet the transition of such magnitude was never without risk. Advisors, generals, and family members had to act with both caution and decisiveness. Every move had consequences. Small mistakes could spark unrest. Large mistakes could invite external attacks. The empire's stability depended on the careful balance of loyalty, tradition, and strategic foresight that Ramses had instilled. In the end, the death of Ramses II was not just the passing of a man, it was the end of an era. Egypt, which had flourished under his vision, now faced the challenge of preserving his achievements. Borders, monuments, alliances, and legacies were all suddenly vulnerable. Yet the influence of the pharaoh endured through his children, his monuments, his religious rituals, and the memory of a ruler who had governed with unparalleled skill and vision. Even centuries later, Ramses' death remains a moment frozen in history, a reminder that even the mightiest are mortal, and that true legacy is measured not only in power, but in the memory, awe, and inspiration left behind. His passing was sorrow, drama, and uncertainty, all intertwined, signaling both an end and a continuation, an empire shaped by one man's vision, and a world forever aware of the pharaoh who had dared to make himself immortal. Centuries passed, but Ramses II refused to be forgotten. His monuments, once gleaming with paint and adorned with gold, began to weather under the relentless desert sun. Stones eroded, inscriptions faded, yet the sheer scale of his ambition made sure that Egypt, and eventually the world, could never ignore him. The pharaoh who had walked the Nile, led armies and commanded divinity, was now immortalized, not in flesh but in stone, story and memory. Abu Simbel stands as perhaps the most astonishing testament to Ramses's vision. Carved into cliffs on the edge of the Nubian desert, the colossal statues gaze eternally over the land they were meant to guard. When first discovered in modern times, their sheer size stunned scholars and travelers alike. Each face reflects authority, divinity, and the unyielding presence of a ruler who understood that memory is as crucial as territory. Even the desert, harsh and unrelenting, could not erase his image, yet monuments are only part of the story. The pharaoh's name appears in inscriptions far from Egypt, on Hittite treaties, in Nubian records, and even in the annals of distant kingdoms. His diplomacy, strategic genius and victories echoed beyond borders, leaving traces in places that had once been hostile or rebellious. To read these records is to understand that Ramses II had created not only a nation but a narrative, a legend that survived war, politics and the erosion of time. Modern discoveries have only amplified the legend. Archaeologists uncover his temples, tombs and statues, often hidden beneath centuries of sand, debris or flood silt. The Ramesseum, with its enormous statues and intricate reliefs, offers insight into his life, campaigns, and the careful orchestration of his image. Every fragment tells a story of ambition, power, and meticulous planning. Even his mummy, found centuries later, speaks volumes. Preserved by human hands and belief in divine legacy, It reminds us that Ramses sought eternity long before modern historians attempted to measure it. The pharaoh's enduring presence is not merely historical, it has become cultural. Writers, artists, and filmmakers have long been fascinated by Ramses II. Stories of Kadesh, Abu Simbel, and his colossal statues capture the imagination, transforming a historical figure into a symbol of ambition, power, and the desire to transcend mortality. Ramses II is not only remembered for what he did, but for what he represented: the possibility of greatness, the pursuit of legacy, and the human drive to be remembered. Yet for all the grandeur, modern discoveries also reveal the human side of this legendary ruler. Reliefs and inscriptions depict Ramses not only as a god or warrior, but as a man concerned with family, diplomacy, and governance. Letters, administrative records, and personal accounts hint at the complexities of ruling an empire, balancing ambition with pragmatism, authority with loyalty, and power with mortality. These fragments of daily life bring the pharaoh closer to us, showing that behind the monumental image was a man navigating challenges that are in essence timeless. Archaeologists have also uncovered evidence of the labor and sacrifice that built his empire. Workers, craftsmen, and soldiers left traces of toil and dedication, often overlooked in grand narratives. Modern historians now understand that Ramses' reign, for all its glory, was built on human effort, endurance, and ingenuity. Each stone carved, each monument raised, and each campaign executed required discipline, vision, and sometimes suffering. This perspective adds layers to his legacy, admiration tempered with recognition of cost. Interestingly, Ramses' impact extends even into contemporary culture. From documentaries to novels, museums to educational programs, his story resonates across centuries. Children learning about Kadesh or Abu Simbel are introduced to ideas of leadership, vision, and ambition. Scholars debate the details of his campaigns and monuments, constantly refining the story. In this way, Ramses' legacy remains dynamic, evolving with each generation that studies, interprets, or reimagines him. And yet, the most fascinating discovery is psychological. Ramses' understanding of memory and influence was centuries ahead of his time. By intertwining warfare, diplomacy, religion, and monumental architecture, he ensured that even the eventual decay of his empire would not erase his presence. Memory became as much a tool of power as armies or treaties, and modern historians continue to marvel at how effectively he managed both human perception and historical record. Even the challenges he faced, aging, rivals, rebellion, mortality, now resonate in a new light. Archaeological evidence combined with modern interpretation reveals a ruler who navigated complexity with strategy, vision, and endurance. Ramses II is thus more than a historical figure. He is a case study in leadership, legacy, and the human desire to transcend the limits of life. His life shows us that immortality is not merely about survival, but about shaping memory, influencing generations, and creating stories that outlive the individual. As we stand today gazing upon the temples, statues, and records left by Ramses II, it becomes clear that his reign was more than a collection of achievements. It was a narrative of human ambition writ large across time. He conquered enemies, forged alliances, built monuments, and shaped a civilization, all while navigating the pressures of mortality and the relentless demands of empire. Through these acts, he transformed Egypt into both a kingdom and a story, ensuring that the pharaoh's presence would endure long after flesh had returned to dust. Ramses II achieved what few rulers dare to imagine. He became eternal. Through memory, monuments, and modern discovery, his life continues to inspire awe, study, and reflection. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that true immortality is not simply living long, it is being remembered, being studied, and being woven into the narrative of humanity itself. The eternal pharaoh lives on, not merely in stone, but in the hearts and minds of all who seek to understand power, legacy, and the human drive to leave a mark on the world. As we reach the final chapter of Ramses II's story, it's tempting to focus solely on his monuments, victories, and divine image. But history is never just about stone or battles. It's about what we can learn, what endures, and how the human spirit shapes the world. Ramses' life was extraordinary, yes, but it is also deeply instructive. It shows us the raw power of vision, the weight of responsibility, and the inescapable cost of greatness. Ramses understood that leadership is more than issuing commands or holding power. It's about perception, foresight, and the careful orchestration of both. He cultivated loyalty not through fear alone, but by blending awe with inspiration. Soldiers, officials, and citizens believed in him because he had created a narrative that intertwined divinity, competence, and personal courage. Modern leaders can learn from this. Authority is strengthened not just by action, but by the story you craft, the values you embody, and the trust you inspire. But Ramses' story also teaches a darker lesson. Greatness demands sacrifice. Behind the grandeur of Abu Simbel, Karnak, and the Ramesseum were countless laborers, soldiers, and citizens whose lives were directed by the pharaoh's ambitions. Behind every military victory lay risk, loss, and human cost. To pursue a vision, one must accept that achievement often comes at the expense of comfort, security, and sometimes the lives of others. Ramses reminds us that leadership is rarely glamorous. It is a balance of courage, strategy, and accountability. Family, too, played a pivotal role in Ramses' legacy. He ensured that succession, alliances, and dynastic continuity were secured, recognizing that even the greatest ruler is only as enduring as the structures they leave behind. Yet this also required navigating rivalry, ambition, and human emotion. His life reminds us that legacy is both public and personal. The way we lead, nurture, and influence those closest to us shapes how history will remember us. True leadership is never isolated. It exists within networks, relationships, and communities. Ramses' mastery of memory and narrative is perhaps his most timeless lesson. He understood that empires rise and fall, armies win and lose, and monuments crumble. But stories, perceptions, and symbols endure. By intertwining military campaigns, religious authority, monumental architecture, and diplomacy, he created a version of immortality. His life shows us that leaving a mark on the world is as much about shaping understanding and inspiring others as it is about achieving power. Every action becomes part of a story, every decision a contribution to a lasting legacy. Yet even Ramses was mortal. Time, age, and death remind us that no amount of skill or ambition can halt the inevitable. This is the paradox of human endeavor. We strive for immortality, but our lives are finite. What endures is not just what we build, but how we influence, inspire, and shape the memory of others. Ramses teaches that greatness is inseparable from humility, the acknowledgement that even legends are human, and that enduring impact is a blend of action, foresight, and story. And there is an emotional dimension to his legacy that cannot be ignored. Ramses' life was filled with victories and challenges, divine favor and mortal vulnerability, glory and grief. He loved, he strategized, he fought, and he endured. For every monument he raised, there were sacrifices, personal, familial, and societal. His story reminds us that leadership is not abstract. It is lived, felt, and experienced. To understand history is to feel the human pressures behind the grandeur. So what can we, in our lives today, take from Ramses II? Leadership is vision married to action. Legacy is crafted not only through what we achieve, but through how we inspire others. Power is a tool that carries responsibility, and greatness is inseparable from sacrifice. Memory and narrative shape influence as much as strength or wealth, and perhaps most importantly, even the most human of leaders can leave a mark that transcends time if they understand the delicate balance of courage, foresight, and resilience. Ramses' story also challenges us to think about how we define greatness. Is it merely conquest, wealth, or titles? Or is it the ability to inspire, to endure, and to leave behind a world richer than the one you inherited? Ramses achieved all of these, but at immense personal and societal cost. The lesson is clear. True leadership demands vision, persistence, and a willingness to shoulder responsibility, both for the triumphs and the burdens. And here's the call to action. If the life of Ramses II teaches us anything, it's that history is not just about observing, it's about learning, reflecting, and acting. We can be inspired by his courage, discipline, and vision, but we must also acknowledge the human cost and the responsibility that comes with influence. Take these lessons into your own life. Lead with vision, plan for the future, honor those who contribute to your journey, and understand that every action shapes legacy. History is alive, and so is the power to shape it. Ramses II became eternal, not because of stone alone, but because his story continues to teach, inspire, and challenge us. So take a moment to reflect. How will you leave your mark? How will your actions, decisions, and vision echo in the lives of others? Every day is an opportunity to be remembered, not just in monuments, but in memory, impact, and inspiration. Ramses II built an empire that lasted centuries, created monuments that defied time, and forged a story that still resonates today. Now it's our turn. Learn from his triumphs, reflect on his challenges, and take action in your own life. Lead with courage, build with purpose, inspire with vision. And remember, the greatest legacy is not only what you achieve, but the lives you touch and the stories that continue because of you. So if Ramses II's journey has moved you, amazed you, or challenged your understanding of leadership, here's what you can do. Hit the like button to honor the story of a pharaoh who defied mortality, subscribe to uncover more untold stories of history, and share your thoughts in the comments. What lesson from Ramses's life will you carry forward? Let's make sure that his story continues to inspire, and that the lessons of history guide the leaders, dreamers, and change-makers of today. Because history isn't just a record of the past, it's a blueprint for the future. And Ramses II's life reminds us that with vision, courage, and persistence, even a single life can echo through the ages.